The first pale fingers of dawn crept through the tall, mullioned windows of Thornfield Manor, casting long shadows across the vast marble entrance hall as Eleanor Hamilton knelt on the cold stone, her back bent in silent suffering, her hands raw and reddened from the harsh lye soap that bit into her skin with each scrubbing motion. She had risen before even the kitchen staff, as was her custom these 21 years of life, having taught her that survival in this household meant becoming both indispensable and invisible. The rhythmic sound of her brush against the marble echoed in the silent grandeur of the entrance hall, a space designed to impress visitors with the wealth and status of the Blackwood family, not to comfort the young woman whose knees ached from hours pressed against unyielding stone. Eleanor paused briefly to push a stray lock of chestnut hair back beneath her plain linen cap, allowing herself the smallest sigh before returning to her task, unaware that she was not, in fact, alone in the vast chamber. From the shadows of the grand staircase, partially concealed behind an ornate banister carved with the Blackwood family crest, Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Westmoreland, stood watching with intense grey eyes that had not closed in restful sleep for more nights than he cared to count. Insomnia had become his constant companion since returning from abroad, driving him to wander his ancestral home when all others slumbered, and for the past se'nnight his restless path had led him here, drawn by the quiet dignity of the young woman who labored while the household slept. Something about her methodical movements and the graceful line of her neck as she bent to her task stirred an unexpected fascination in him, a curiosity about what thoughts might move behind her downcast eyes. Eleanor felt the weight of observation prickle along her spine, a sixth sense developed through years of navigating the capricious moods of her guardian, Mrs. Bentley. But she did not look up or acknowledge the presence she sensed in the shadows. Experience had taught her that drawing attention to herself never ended well, that it was safer to remain unnoticed, unremarkable, though she could not quite suppress the slight tensing of her shoulders as she felt the unseen gaze linger upon her. She focused instead on the small circle of clean marble beneath her brush, finding satisfaction in the transformation from dull to gleaming, a small victory in a life that afforded few triumphs. Sebastian shifted his weight slightly, causing the ancient floorboard beneath his slippered foot to release a gentle creak. But if Eleanor heard, she gave no indication, continuing her work with the same quiet determination that had drawn his attention these past mornings. As the growing light began to chase away the shadows that concealed him, he retreated silently up the stairs, returning to his chambers before the household stirred to life, carrying with him the image of her bent form and the strange peace her presence had momentarily granted his troubled mind. 3 years prior, Eleanor had lived a life as distant from her current circumstance as the stars from the earth, the cherished only daughter of Dr. James Hamilton, whose medical brilliance and steady hands had once saved the previous Duke of Westmoreland from a fever that had confounded every other physician in London. The Hamiltons had resided in a comfortable townhouse in the fashionable part of the city, surrounded by books, music, and the steady stream of grateful patients who sought her father, many of them from the highest echelons of society. Eleanor had been educated alongside the daughters of nobility, her quick mind nurtured by her scholarly father and her gentle spirit shaped by her mother, whose watercolors had once been displayed at the Royal Academy. The memory of those days now seemed to belong to another life entirely, a golden dream from which she had been cruelly awakened on a rain-slick road when the carriage carrying her parents home from a medical conference had overturned on a treacherous bend, killing them instantly and leaving 18-year-old Eleanor alone in the world with nothing but her grief and the modest inheritance her father had accumulated through his practice. With no close relatives willing to take her in, she had been placed under the guardianship of her father, second cousin, Mrs. Agatha Bentley, the housekeeper at Thornfield Manor, who had always resented Dr. Hamilton for his success and the respect he commanded among the aristocracy, a resentment that had immediately transferred to his orphaned daughter. The change in Eleanor, fortune had been swift and merciless. Within weeks of arriving at Thornfield, Mrs. Bentley had moved her from the comfortable guest chamber to a smaller room, then to a cramped attic space shared with a scullery maid, explaining that Eleanor must learn to be useful if she wished to remain under her roof. Legal documents requiring her signature appeared with alarming frequency, always presented when Eleanor was at her most exhausted or vulnerable. Papers she now realized had systematically transferred her inheritance into Mrs. Bentley. Control. The final humiliation had come 6 months ago when Mrs. Bentley had summoned Eleanor to her private sitting room and presented her with a plain servant, dress and cap, informing her that since the funds for her keeping had been exhausted, she would now earn her bread through service to the household. "Your father may have saved a duke, but you will never be more than a servant in this house," Mrs. Bentley had declared. Her thin lips curled in triumph as she watched Eleanor, fingers tremble over the coarse fabric of her new station. Day by day, week by week, the bright, cultured young woman who had once moved comfortably through London, finest drawing rooms had been methodically erased, replaced by the silent, efficient servant who now scrubbed the floors of Thornfield before dawn, her true identity known to none but the woman who had orchestrated her fall from grace. Sebastian Blackwood, the 8th Duke of Westmoreland, had returned to Thornfield Manor merely 3 weeks prior. After spending 4 years travelling through the far reaches of the empire in an attempt to outrun the grief that had consumed him since the death of his young wife in childbirth. The heir to one of England's oldest titles had finally accepted that duty required his presence at the ancestral home he had fled, though the quiet halls still echoed with memories he preferred to avoid. His study had become his sanctuary, a space transformed by the artifacts of his travels, the walls adorned with maps marked with his journeys, shelves lined with volumes collected from the libraries of Alexandria to Calcutta, display cases holding curiosities from every corner of the known world, each item a testament to his desperate search for meaning in the aftermath of devastating loss. It was well past midnight when Sebastian pulled the bell cord beside his desk, requesting tea to ease his perpetual sleeplessness, his attention focused on the translation of an ancient Persian text that had thus far proven the only distraction powerful enough to quiet his restless mind. The soft knock at his study door came sooner than expected, and he called for entry without looking up from his work, accustomed to the elderly butler who typically attended to his nocturnal needs. The sound of lighter footsteps than anticipated caused him to raise his eyes, finding instead the young woman he had observed scrubbing the floors at dawn, now standing before him with a silver tea tray held steady in her reddened hands. Their eyes met for the first time, her swift curtsy performed with a natural grace that seemed at odds with her position, her gaze quickly lowering in appropriate deference, yet not before Sebastian had glimpsed intelligence and wariness in depths of green that reminded him of the forests surrounding his Italian villa. As she arranged the tea service with practiced efficiency, he observed her movements, noting the subtle tells that had first drawn his attention during his pre-dawn observations. Her spine too straight for one born to service, her hands too delicate despite their current roughened state. "You are not a typical housemaid," he stated, watching with interest as she stilled momentarily before resuming her task. "I serve where I am placed, Your Grace," she replied, her diction precise and cultured despite the simplicity of her statement, further confirming his suspicions. When she finished preparing his tea exactly to his preference without instruction, she turned to leave, but paused briefly before a shelf containing his rarest volumes, her gaze lingering on a first edition of Paradise Lost, with such obvious recognition that Sebastian found himself asking her opinion of Milton. Her response, though carefully measured, revealed an education far beyond that of any servant in his household, and as she slipped from the room with another perfect curtsy, the Duke found himself more intrigued by the mysterious young woman than by any curiosity he had collected in his years of wandering the globe. For all the hardships of her reduced circumstances, Eleanor had discovered one small mercy in her life at Thornfield. The vast library with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes remained unlocked at night, offering a sanctuary she could visit only when her exhausting duties were complete and the household slumbered. Each evening, after completing her final tasks, she would slip silently through the darkened corridors with a single candle, finding her way to this temple of knowledge, where for a precious hour or two she could reclaim fragments of her former self. On this particular night, the full moon cast brilliant silver beams through the tall library windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like fairy creatures in the still air as Eleanor moved reverently among the shelves, trailing her fingers along familiar spines until she found a volume of Wordsworth she had not yet explored. So absorbed was she in the poetry that the slight creak of the door opening failed to alert her to another presence until a shadow fell across her page, causing her to start violently, nearly dropping the precious book as she looked up to find the Duke himself standing before her, his tall form silhouetted against the moonlight. Fear clutched at her throat as she scrambled to her feet, certain that this transgression would result in her immediate dismissal, already calculating in her mind how she might survive on London streets with neither references nor connections. Yet instead of anger, the Duke, expression held curiosity as he gestured for her to remain seated. His voice low and measured as he inquired about her choice of reading material. When she haltingly explained her appreciation for Wordsworth, pastoral imagery, he surprised her by selecting a different volume from a nearby shelf, opening it to a specific page, and asking her opinion on Coleridge, interpretation of nature as compared to his contemporary. The tension in her shoulders gradually eased as they spoke, her initial terror giving way to cautious engagement as the Duke settled into a chair opposite her, the moonlight casting both their features in silver and shadow, creating an otherworldly intimacy that seemed to exist outside the rigid hierarchies of their daytime lives. Sebastian found himself mesmerized by the transformation in the young woman before him, watching as her formal servant, demeanor melted away to reveal flashes of passionate intelligence, her hands animating her points about the poetry with gestures that spoke of a genteel upbringing, her vocabulary expanding beyond the careful simplicity she maintained in her role as housemaid. More surprising still was his own response to her company, the familiar weight of isolation that had pressed upon him since his return to England, seeming to lighten in the presence of her genuine enthusiasm for literature, her unaffected joy in these stolen moments of intellectual engagement stirring something in him he had thought long buried with his wife. As the night deepened around them, neither seemed willing to break the spell by acknowledging the impropriety of their situation, each silently recognizing in the other a kindred spirit, despite the vast gulf of circumstance that separated the master of Thornfield from the servant who scrubbed its floors. The keen eyes of Mrs. Bentley had not failed to notice the subtle shift in the Duke, manner toward Eleanor, the way his gaze followed her movements when they chanced to be in the same room, how he seemed to appear in whatever part of the house she happened to be cleaning. With calculating malice born of both jealousy and fear that her misdeeds might be discovered, the housekeeper began assigning Eleanor tasks designed to break both body and spirit, sending her to scrub the cellar steps with a toothbrush, clean the chimney flues despite the availability of proper sweeps, and polish every piece of silver in the vast collection not once but 3 times to correct imagined imperfections. Sleep became a luxury Eleanor could scarcely afford as her duties expanded to include both the earliest morning and latest night tasks, leaving her precious few hours for rest before beginning anew. Within a fortnight, Her already slender frame had grown gaunt, dark shadows appearing beneath her eyes like bruises against her pallid skin, her movements slowing despite her determined efforts to maintain the efficiency expected of her. Yet never once did she complain or falter, completing each degrading task with the same quiet dignity that had first caught the Duke. Attention, though now her hands trembled with exhaustion, and her breath came in shallow gasps when she believed no one was watching. Sebastian observed this systematic cruelty with mounting concern and rage, particularly when he discovered Eleanor scrubbing the scullery floor on her hands and knees during the small hours of the night, her body swaying with fever as she fought to complete the task before dawn. He had seen enough. Striding forward, he ordered her to stop at once, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, even as she struggled to rise and curtsy properly, her legs buckling beneath her from weakness. Without hesitation, he caught her before she could collapse, shocked at how little she weighed as he lifted her into his arms, despite her feeble protests that she was quite well and must finish her duties. "I have travelled the world and never seen such quiet strength in the face of such petty tyranny," he told her as he carried her toward the main staircase, his voice low with a mixture of admiration and barely contained fury at how she had been treated. Over her continued murmured objections, Sebastian summoned the startled night footman, instructing him to fetch both the physician from the village and Mrs. Bentley immediately, his expression so thunderous that the servant fled to obey without question. As he carefully placed Eleanor on a settee in his private study, rather than returning her to the servants' quarters, the Duke found himself overcome by a protective instinct he had not felt since his wife, illness. A fierce determination that this remarkable young woman would suffer no further at the hands of his housekeeper, regardless of what society might say about his unusual interest in a mere servant. The confrontation with Mrs. Bentley following Eleanor, collapse had yielded more questions than answers. The housekeeper, explanations about the young woman, circumstances growing increasingly tangled under Sebastian, pointed inquiry. According to Mrs. Bentley, Eleanor was merely a distant relation taken in from charity after being left destitute by her irresponsible father. Yet this tale contradicted the refinement evident in the young woman, speech and bearing. Most curiously, when pressed about the specific relationship, Mrs. Bentley had claimed first that Eleanor was her second cousin once removed, then later referred to her as a third cousin by marriage. Inconsistencies that raised Sebastian, suspicions further. The very next morning, the Duke dispatched his most trusted secretary to London with instructions to inquire discreetly about a Dr. James Hamilton and his daughter, particularly any information regarding the circumstances of the daughter, guardianship and inheritance following her parents' demise. While awaiting these answers, Sebastian took measures to ensure Eleanor recovery and protection without openly challenging Mrs. Bentley, authority, a delicate balance that required careful maneuvering within the complex hierarchy of the household. The physician had ordered a fortnight of rest, a prescription that had sent Mrs. Bentley into barely concealed apoplexy until the Duke himself had insisted it would be followed to the letter. Upon returning to her small attic chamber after 3 days of recovery in a rarely used guest room, Eleanor discovered subtle but significant changes to her circumstances. A thick woolen shawl appeared folded on her bed. Her thin mattress had been replaced with one of superior quality, and somehow her duties had been revised to exclude the most physically demanding tasks despite Mrs. Bentley. Continued frosty demeanor. The servants, hall whispers, suggested the Duke himself had issued specific instructions regarding her care, though none could confirm having heard such orders directly. The food that appeared at her place during servants, meals had mysteriously improved in both quality and quantity, and occasionally she would find a small plate of sweetmeats or fruit left in unlikely places where her duties would take her. Anonymous kindnesses, that brought colour back to her cheeks and a cautious light to her eyes. Throughout Thornfield Manor, a palpable tension had begun to build, as Mrs. Bentley observed these changes with increasing agitation. Her thin lips pressed into a bloodless line whenever she caught sight of Eleanor looking less gaunt or completing her reduced duties with greater ease. The housekeeper had taken to watching the Duke with wary calculation whenever he entered a room, noting how his eyes invariably sought out and found the chestnut-haired servant, regardless of how inconspicuously Eleanor attempted to blend into the background. Sebastian felt the weight of this scrutiny, yet continued his subtle campaign of protection while awaiting news from London, determined to uncover the truth about the mysterious young woman whose quiet dignity had awakened something within him that he had believed long dead, a sense of purpose beyond mere existence and a growing conviction that justice must be served regardless of the cost to social propriety. Pale gold light had just begun to chase away the lingering shadows of night as Eleanor knelt among the rose bushes in the eastern garden, the early morning mist hanging like gossamer veils over the blooms her mother had once tended at their London home, cuttings that had somehow found their way to Thornfield through the previous Duchess, love of horticulture. Eleanor had discovered this connection by chance while reading the careful notations in the garden journal, finding her own mother, maiden name inscribed beside several varieties that had been gifted to the estate some 15 years prior. She came here in rare moments of freedom, finding comfort in pruning the leggy stems and clearing the persistent weeds that threatened to choke the magnificent blooms, her fingers remembering the lessons her mother had taught her, even as her heart ached with the memory. So absorbed was she in this bittersweet task that she failed to notice the tall figure approaching through the mist until his shadow fell across the roses, causing her to look up with a start into the face of the Duke himself, his formal attire abandoned for a simple shirt and riding breeches. Without waiting for her to rise or curtsy, Sebastian lowered himself to the stone bench nearest her, his usual reserve softening as he gestured for her to continue her work while he spoke of his own mother, love for these same gardens, his voice carrying a warmth she had not heard before. The conversation that followed seemed to exist outside the strict boundaries of master and servant, flowing naturally from gardens to grief as Eleanor cautiously shared fragments of her loss, surprised when the Duke responded not with polite sympathy, but with genuine understanding born of his own bereavement. "We are both haunted, it seems," he observed, watching as her deft fingers dead-headed a fading bloom. "Yet it is in the dawn light that ghosts finally rest." "Your Grace," she replied softly, a statement that caused him to study her face with new appreciation before a rare smile transformed his solemn features. What followed was unlike any exchange Eleanor had experienced since her parents, deaths, a conversation that ranged from literature to philosophy, punctuated by moments of unexpected humor as Sebastian recounted misadventures from his travels that drew genuine laughter from her lips for the first time in years. As the mist began to burn away beneath the strengthening sun, neither seemed eager to break the spell of this strange communion, both recognizing in the other a kindred spirit who understood the particular loneliness of carrying grief through a world that expected one to move forward without looking back, finding in their shared understanding a connection that transcended the vast gulf of their social positions. The arrival of Mr. Winters, the Duke, trusted family solicitor, brought with it a storm that would forever alter the quiet rhythm of Thornfield Manor, the elderly gentleman appearing at breakfast with a leather portfolio containing documents that confirmed Sebastian, growing suspicions about Eleanor, true circumstances. According to the carefully preserved records, not only was Eleanor indeed the daughter of the esteemed Dr. James Hamilton, who had once saved the former Duke, life, but she was also the legitimate heiress to a considerable fortune that should have provided her with comfort and independence following her parents, untimely deaths. The Duke wasted no time in summoning the entire household staff to the great hall, his face a mask of controlled fury as he stood before the assembled servants with Eleanor and the solicitor at his side, Mrs. Bentley looking increasingly pale as she noted the leather portfolio and official papers in Mr. Winter's gnarled hands. In a voice that rang with the authority of his ancient title, Sebastian laid bare the fraud that had been perpetrated beneath his roof, revealing how Mrs. Bentley had systematically diverted Eleanor inheritance into her own accounts through a series of falsified documents bearing forged signatures, reducing her own blood relation to virtual slavery while living comfortably on the stolen funds. The evidence was irrefutable, Mr. Winters producing original documents alongside the forgeries, as well as bank records showing substantial deposits to Mrs. Bentley, personal accounts corresponding exactly with withdrawals from the Hamilton estate. Throughout this exposure, Eleanor stood perfectly still, her face a complex canvas of emotions, flashing from disbelief to vindication to a cold anger that transformed her delicate features into something almost fierce. Yet beneath these stronger feelings flickered uncertainty about what this revelation would mean for her future at Thornfield, the only home she had known since her parents' passing. When Mrs. Bentley finally broke her shocked silence to protest that Eleanor had signed the papers willingly, the solicitor produced a damning report from a handwriting expert confirming that the signatures had indeed been forged, a revelation that caused several of the housemaids to gasp aloud, their eyes darting between the trembling housekeeper and the young woman they had been taught to consider beneath them. Sebastian concluded the confrontation by announcing that Mrs. Bentley would be removed from her position immediately and held at Thornfield until the magistrate could arrive to address the criminal aspects of her actions, adding that Miss Hamilton would henceforth be treated with all the respect due her true station, a declaration that sent ripples of confusion through the staff who could scarcely reconcile their former fellow servant with the gentlewoman now revealed before them. As the stunned household dispersed to whisper among themselves about this extraordinary turn of events, Eleanor found herself standing in the suddenly empty hall, her hard-won identity as a servant stripped away as abruptly as it had been forced upon her, leaving her adrift between worlds, neither the downtrodden housemaid she had become, nor quite able to reclaim the confident young woman she had been before tragedy altered her path. The transition from her sparse attic chamber to the lavish blue guest suite overlooking the gardens occurred with a swiftness that left Eleanor feeling as though she had stepped into another woman, life, the same servants who had previously ignored her existence, now curtsying as they addressed her as Miss Hamilton in tones of exaggerated respect that could not quite mask their confusion and resentment. Sebastian had arranged everything with characteristic thoroughness, summoning a dressmaker from London who arrived with trunks of ready-made gowns that required only minor alterations to fit her diminished frame, assigning a young housemaid named Sarah to serve as her lady, maid, and engaging Mr. Winters to begin the lengthy process of reclaiming her stolen inheritance. Yet for all the sudden luxury surrounding her, Eleanor had never felt more isolated, sitting stiffly on brocade chairs that once would have represented unimaginable comfort, but now seemed to emphasize her uncertain place in the household. She found herself hesitating before touching the silver-backed brushes on her dressing table, apologizing instinctively when Sarah brought her tea, and rising at dawn from habit only to stand awkwardly in her nightgown with no floors to scrub, no fires to light, no purpose to fulfill. Most troubling of all was the subtle shift in her interactions with the Duke, the easy connection they had found in the rose garden giving way to a new formality. As Sebastian, manner grew increasingly proper with each passing day, the protocol of their respective stations reasserting itself now that she was no longer a servant whose relationship with the master could be easily dismissed. When they chanced to meet in the library or during meals, which she now took at his table rather than below stairs, a palpable tension stretched between them. Eleanor, keenly aware of the whispers that must be circulating about a young, unmarried woman residing under the roof of a bachelor duke, regardless of the unusual circumstances. While she detected no diminishment in his concern for her welfare, she sensed his growing awareness that their previous intimacy had been possible only because of her invisible status, a truth that brought her both resentment and a strange sense of loss. Each night she would stand at the window of her beautiful prison, gazing out at the moon silvering the gardens where they had once spoken so freely, surrounded by fine furnishings and expensive trinkets that only emphasized how she belonged nowhere, caught between the servant, world she had reluctantly mastered, and the gentle society that would never truly accept her again after 3 years of degradation. Her only certainty, the knowledge that the man whose quiet attention had sustained her through her darkest days now seemed more unreachable than when she had knelt scrubbing his floors at dawn. The local assembly rooms blazed with light from a dozen crystal chandeliers, the polished floor reflecting their brilliance as couples moved through the intricate patterns of a country dance, the air filled with music, perfume, and the constant murmur of conversation that faltered noticeably when Sebastian escorted Eleanor into the crowded hall. 3 weeks had passed since her true identity had been restored, yet this marked her first venture into society as the Duke of Westmoreland Ward, a position hastily arranged to provide some semblance of propriety to her residence at Thornfield. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze upon her as she moved through the room in a gown of pale blue silk that the dressmaker had assured her was the height of fashion, though it could not disguise her discomfort as she faced the curious scrutiny of people who had once been her social equals. The initial polite greetings soon gave way to whispered comments behind fluttering fans, the sharp eyes of the local gentry noting every detail of her appearance and behavior for later dissection. Lady Harrow, whose husband owned neighboring lands, made no attempt to lower her voice as she remarked to her companion that one could take the girl from the scullery but never truly remove the taint of service, a comment that brought high-pitched laughter from the circle of elegantly dressed women surrounding her. When the elderly Sir William Patterson approached to request a dance, several younger ladies visibly smirked, one wondering aloud whether Miss Hamilton might be more comfortable serving refreshments than participating in the quadrille. Throughout the evening, the gossip grew increasingly bold, speculation about Eleanor, relationship with the Duke ranging from suggestions that she had been his mistress disguised as a servant to theories that her supposed inheritance was merely a fiction created to justify his unusual interest in her. Sebastian observed these cruelties with mounting anger until Lady Harrow made a particularly cutting remark about women who rose above their station through dubious means, at which point he abandoned all pretense of ignoring the gossip. In full hearing of the assembly, he coldly informed her ladyship that Miss Hamilton lineage was far more distinguished than many present could claim, her temporary reduction in circumstances being the result of criminal actions for which justice was now being served. The silence that followed his declaration hung heavily in the air, broken only when the musicians nervously resumed playing, though the damage had been done as speculation now shifted to why the Duke would defend a former servant with such passion. As they departed the assembly earlier than planned, Eleanor gazed up at Sebastian, face with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "Your defense only confirms their suspicions, Your Grace," she murmured as he handed her into his carriage. Some stains cannot be washed away, no matter how vigorously one scrubs. The quiet dignity of her words, revealing both her acceptance of social reality and the painful knowledge she had gained on her knees with brush in hand. The journey back to Thornfield from London should have been one of triumph. The legal papers restoring Eleanor, inheritance to her control securely stowed in the Duke travelling case, yet the skies had darkened ominously as they left the city. unleashing a deluge that transformed country roads into treacherous rivers of mud. The accident occurred with frightening suddenness, the carriage wheels sliding on a sharp bend, the vehicle tilting precipitously before overturning completely, leaving them shaken but mercifully uninjured, save for minor bruises. With the driver dispatched to seek help from the nearest village some miles distant, Sebastian and Eleanor found themselves forced to seek immediate shelter from the worsening storm, fortune providing an abandoned gamekeeper cottage nestled among ancient oaks a short distance from the road. The small stone structure offered rudimentary protection, its thatched roof mostly intact despite years of neglect. A single room containing a rough wooden table, a simple chair, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. Sebastian managed to light a fire in the small hearth using wood stacked beside the chimney, the flames casting dancing shadows across the weathered walls as rain lashed against the single window with increasing fury. The intimate confines of their temporary refuge making it impossible to maintain the careful distance they had established in recent weeks. As the storm raged outside, mirroring the emotional tempest within, Sebastian finally broke the silence that had stretched between them, confessing that he had suffered from debilitating insomnia since his wife, death, endless nights spent wandering the empty corridors of Thornfield, seeking some respite from grief and guilt. He spoke softly of how he had first noticed Eleanor at dawn weeks ago, drawn to the window overlooking the entrance hall by the sound of her brush against marble depths, finding in her quiet determination and methodical movements a strange comfort that had eased his restless mind. There was something about your presence in that vast space, something in the way you transformed small circles of stone from dull to gleaming that brought the first moments of peace I had known in years, he admitted, his usually guarded expression open in the firelight, as he described how he had returned each morning to watch her unseen, drawing strength from her resilience as she faced her own hardships with quiet dignity. Eleanor, cheeks flushed with more than just the heat of the fire, confessed that she had always sensed his presence during those dawn hours, feeling the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, yet drawing comfort from it rather than discomfort, finding in his unseen company the courage to endure another day of Mrs. Bentley cruelty. Even not knowing it was you, I felt less alone in those moments, she whispered, the barrier of rank and propriety that had separated them crumbling in the face of this shared confession. As they sat beside the humble hearth, the howling storm isolating them from the world and its judgments, both recognized that they had reached a crisis point in their relationship, the truth of their connection now acknowledged, creating both possibility and peril in equal measure. 3 days after their return to Thornfield, the fragile peace between them shattered like glass when Sebastian summoned Eleanor to his study, as evening shadows lengthened across the grounds and yet another storm gathered on the horizon. Rain had begun to lash against the tall windows of the book-lined sanctuary, droplets streaming down the glass like tears as Eleanor entered to find the Duke standing before the hearth, his tall frame silhouetted by firelight, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed. Without preamble, he crossed the room to take her hands in his, speaking with an intensity that stole her breath as he declared that their shared confidences in the gamekeeper cottage had confirmed what he had suspected for weeks, that the connection between them transcended conventional understanding and could no longer be denied. Despite the certain scandal, despite the whispers that would follow them through every drawing room in England, he wished to make her his duchess, to build a life with the woman whose quiet strength had awakened his heart from years of slumber. His words tumbling forth with uncharacteristic emotion as lightning flashed beyond the windows, illuminating her face in brief, brilliant moments. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet, joy and terror warring within her chest as she gently withdrew her hands from his grasp, stepping back even as her heart urged her forward. She could not allow him to sacrifice his position, his reputation, the respect of his peers for a woman who had scrubbed his floors, regardless of her restored fortune or true parentage. Society had made its judgment clear at the assembly, and she understood better than he the permanent nature of such stains upon one character. "I cannot accept," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the trembling of her heart. "You offer from guilt, perhaps from pity, but I will not be the cause of your social ruin." Sebastian, face darkened with frustration as he insisted his proposal stemmed from neither obligation nor compassion, but from genuine love, a declaration that nearly broke her resolve. Still, Eleanor stood firm. Years of hardship having taught her that wishes and reality rarely aligned, that dreams pursued selfishly often became nightmares. "I would rather love you from a distance than be the cause of your ruin," she told him, the simple dignity of her words revealing both the depth of her feelings and the strength of her conviction. Society forgives many transgressions in a duke, but elevating a former servant to duchess would invite contempt that would follow not just us, but any children we might have. The storm outside reached its crescendo as Sebastian turned away, his shoulders rigid with controlled emotion, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the middle of his study, caught between the future she desperately desired and the sacrifice her love demanded, the rain beating against the windows, echoing the tears she refused to shed in his presence. The morning mist still clung to the gardens of Thornfield as Eleanor, trunk was loaded onto the London-bound coach, her decision to leave the estate having been made with the same quiet determination that had carried her through years of hardship. Sebastian had not attempted to dissuade her once he recognized the resolve in her eyes, his respect for her choice evident in the careful arrangements he had made for her journey, despite the pain visible in his gaze as they exchanged formal farewells in the entrance hall where he had first observed her scrubbing floors at dawn. Within a fortnight of her arrival in London, Eleanor had secured a modest but elegant townhouse in a respectable neighborhood, the rooms filled with simple furnishings chosen for comfort rather than ostentation, creating a warm sanctuary that stood in stark contrast to the grand but often cold chambers of Thornfield. Using the considerable funds now properly restored to her control, she established what she named Hamilton House, a home for young girls orphaned by circumstance, dedicating herself to ensuring that no child under her care would suffer the exploitation she had endured, her own experiences providing unique insight into the wounds that required healing. Each morning the postman delivered a letter bearing the Westmoreland seal, the Duke maintaining his connection through daily correspondence despite the distance she had placed between them. Yet Eleanor could not bring herself to break the wax on a single one, storing them instead in a wooden box beneath her bed, simultaneously unable to read his words, yet unwilling to destroy them. As summer gave way to autumn and then winter, Eleanor found herself transformed by her work with the orphaned girls, her natural intelligence and compassion flourishing as she developed innovative approaches to education and emotional support, attracting attention from reform-minded members of London society who had begun to seek her counsel on matters relating to the welfare of disadvantaged children. When she occasionally attended small gatherings hosted by her new circle of acquaintances, she heard whispers that the Duke of Westmoreland had withdrawn almost completely from society, spending his days managing his estates with unprecedented attention to the conditions of his tenants and his nights alone in his study. The grand balls and dinners that should have graced Thornfield conspicuously absent from the social calendar. Though such reports caused an ache to bloom beneath her ribs, Eleanor reminded herself of the rightness of her decision, finding solace in the laughter of the girls who now filled her days, and the knowledge that the pain of separation was preferable to watching society slowly destroy the man she loved through association with her tarnished reputation. On nights when sleep proved elusive, she would stand at the window of her modest bedchamber, gazing at the distant glow of London street lamps and wondering if Sebastian too stood watching the night sky, the vast physical distance between them. Nothing compared to the gulf of social convention that had forced her departure from the only man who had seen her true worth beneath the servant cap. The first pale fingers of dawn had just begun to streak the eastern sky when Eleanor stepped into the small garden behind her London home, seeking solace in the quiet morning ritual of tending the modest rose bushes she had transplanted from her parents' former garden. The air held that perfect stillness unique to early morning, dew glistening on unfurling leaves like tiny diamonds scattered by an unseen hand, the familiar work allowing her mind a rare moment of peace before the bustling day of managing Hamilton House would begin. So absorbed was she in pruning a particularly stubborn cane that she failed to notice the tall figure standing at the garden gate until his shadow fell across the path, causing her to look up with a start into the face she had carried in her heart through 6 months of separation. Sebastian stood before her, not in the formal attire of a duke, but dressed simply in riding clothes, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and hope as he asked permission to enter her domain. The months had changed him, new lines etching his face, a touch of silver at his temples that had not been there before, yet his eyes held a clarity and purpose she had never seen during their time at Thornfield. As the rising sun bathed the garden in golden light, he spoke of how he had followed reports of her work with orphaned girls, respecting her independence even as he found himself increasingly drawn to the philosophy that guided Hamilton House. With quiet intensity, he revealed how her departure had forced him to reconsider his place in society, leading him to withdraw from the shallow diversions of the ton to focus instead on implementing reforms across his vast estates, improving conditions for tenants and labourers in ways that had scandalized his peers but brought unprecedented prosperity to his lands. "I once watched you from shadows, admiring your strength," he told her, his voice low with emotion as the morning light illuminated them both. "Now I stand in the light, asking not for your hand, but for your heart as equals. The world will still disapprove, society will still whisper, but I have discovered that a life lived according to their expectations is no life at all." From a pocket he withdrew the wooden box she kept beneath her bed, explaining that her housekeeper had entrusted it to him upon learning of his visit, believing the time had come for her to read what she had been unable to face. As Eleanor opened the box with trembling fingers, reading fragments of letters that revealed not obligation or pity, but a love that had deepened through absence, understanding the journey he had undertaken to transform himself into a man who could stand beside her rather than above her, she felt the final walls around her heart crumble like the morning mist now burning away in the strengthening sunlight. In this garden where new life pushed through soil with quiet determination, surrounded by the symbolic dawn of a new beginning, Eleanor finally allowed herself to reach for the happiness she had denied them both, placing her soil-stained hand in his as equals at last. The rising sun of early spring gilded the marble floors of Thornfield Manor, light spilling through the tall windows of the entrance hall where the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland knelt side by side, sleeves rolled up as they worked in companionable silence to prepare for the arrival of 20 new students later that morning. 1 year had passed since their wedding in the small London chapel near Hamilton House, a year that had seen the transformation of the ancient estate from a symbol of aristocratic isolation to a thriving school and refuge where women from all walks of life could find education, purpose, and community. The vast library now served as a classroom, Formal drawing rooms had become dormitories, and the rose garden had expanded to include practical herbs and vegetables tended by eager hands. Eleanor paused in her work to observe her husband, still finding wonder in the sight of Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Westmoreland, on his knees with soap and brush, his determination to participate in every aspect of their shared vision having scandalized his peers, even as it earned their grudging respect. Their unusual marriage had upended convention not through deliberate rebellion, but through quiet example, their insistence on working as equals proving more revolutionary than any political manifesto. Mrs. Winters, the kind elderly woman who had replaced Mrs. Bentley as housekeeper, discovered them as she descended the grand staircase, her laughter echoing through the hall at the sight of a duke performing such menial labor. "I never thought to see the day when a Blackwood would scrub his own floors," she declared, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes as Sebastian rose to help Eleanor to her feet, both of them damp and somewhat disheveled, yet radiating contentment. "It seems fitting," Eleanor replied, exchanging a look of deep understanding with her husband. "This hall witnessed our beginning after all." Sebastian nodded, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. "From dawn shadows to morning light, we have both found our way home," he murmured, the simple truth of his words encompassing their extraordinary journey from solitude to partnership. Later that afternoon, as the new students explored their quarters with barely contained excitement, a letter arrived from London containing a clipping from the society pages that prompted shared laughter between the Duke and Duchess. The notorious gossip column that had once predicted their social ruin now declared the eccentric Duke and his unusual Duchess the height of fashion, reporting that several prominent noble families had begun petitioning to have their daughters admitted to the Thornfield Academy, with its revolutionary approach to female education becoming the talk of London drawing rooms. The world had not changed entirely, of course. Pockets of resistance to their vision remained entrenched in traditional circles. Yet as Eleanor watched Sebastian guiding a former factory girl through the basics of accounting in what had once been his private study, she recognized that they had succeeded not in conforming to society, but in creating a new definition of what society might become. One scrubbed floor and one transformed life at a time.